Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll have a few more people join us as the webinar progresses. I am Jeff Martin, and I am Director of Communications and Public Affairs here at the American Anthropological Association. I am an older white male with graying brown hair, black framed glasses, and a black collared polo shirt. And I'm reporting to you from the confines of my apartment, still in the apartment, but hopefully that's going to be changing soon. Welcome to Charlottesville TeachIn and its impact, white power, genocide, and yes, it can happen here. This promises to be a fascinating webinar, something I've been looking forward to. It's a topic that's deeply troubling and continues to be one of the top issues in this country, if not the world. In addition to the topic itself, which I'm interested in, I'm also particularly interested to hear about the popular teach-in following the events of Charlottesville. So this is going to be interesting. To make this more accessible to everyone, we're providing closed captioning. For if you need closed captioning, move your cursor to the bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll see the icon and just click on it. It'll appear. If you would like to ask your question verbally or hop on video, please use the raise hand feature in the reaction site and we'll take care of it there. Direct any access needs to Nell, our accessibility coordinator, and she's listed as such in the chat. A reminder to keep your video and microphone turned off. However, we're going to flip that, and once we get to the question and answer portion, since there are not a lot of people on this, I don't think we have to worry about bandwidth. Please do feel free, once we go to Q&A, feel free to turn your mic on and your video on. And we'd like to make this kind of conversational. So it'll be good for you to join us at that point. Before then, if you do have a question, use the chat feature and type in your question in the chat. And even if it's for later on, we will address it accordingly. So that's it for now. Without any further ado, let me turn you over to Alex.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. And I'd like to thank Ed, Nell, Scott, Janice, and the whole team there for putting on this event. And it's nice to know that the webinar will continue on afterwards. Certainly some of the things in relationship to pedagogy, I think maybe will be interesting to discuss during the Q&A period. And just to sort of give you a sense for the structure, I'm going to speak for maybe 15 to 17 minutes, somewhere in there. And then two students who participated in the Charlottesville teach-in will speak for 5 to 7 minutes. And then I think we're aiming for 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A if there are any questions. So I'm Alex Hinton. I'm an older white male wearing I go with the pronouns he, him, his. I'm wearing a dark blue jacket, tie, and I'm delighted to be speaking to you from my home in New Jersey. Anyways, I'm delighted to be here. I am going to share my screen. Okay, and as we move through, I'll be verbally describing the slides. So anyways, this is the title slide to the talk with the title that Jeff just mentioned, Charlottesville teach-in and its impact, white power, genocide, and yes, it can happen here. The visual in the slide is a line of, familiar to many of you, a line of marchers with tiki torches at Charlottesville. And on the bottom part of the screen, I have my name and Twitter at Alex L. Hinton. And I notes that I'm a distinguished professor of anthropology at Rutgers University in Newark, and I direct the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about, there's sort of two prongs to this. So this slide, on this slide, we have a picture of my book cover and the table of contents, as well as a notation that the book comes out on June 8th. And I'll circle around to that at the very end. But I'm going to be talking sort of about the larger book project but in particular about the Charlottesville teach-in that I held. In terms of presentation structure, and I'm on a new slide now, in the slide at the center, we have a copy of the book, It Can Happen Here, but the title and a snake with its mouth open. On the upper right-hand side of the screen, there's an image that says a moment. Below it, there's an open door with 3 hinges, wooden hinges. On the left, bottom left, is a picture of a road with 2 boulders, and in the upper left-hand part of the screen are 4 stepping stones. And that's basically the structure of the presentation today to introduce you to the project and the Charlottesville teach-in that I taught. So to begin with the moment is Charlottesville. And so at that time, there were some other echoes before. For example, I testified at the Members Tribunal in Cambodia as then candidate Trump was securing the nomination for the GOP. And I was thinking about doing some writing then, but it was really Charlottesville that stirred my interest in doing a bigger project. Because at the time, as some of you may know, there were chants, blood and soil, you will not replace us, Jews will not replace us. And these were very familiar to me with echoes of Nazi Germany. And so there were these different resonances. And sort of the bigger background question that I wanted to address in some form of written exercise was whether, this was exceptional or a symptom. And of course, I thought it was a symptom of something else, and that really set the project going in different directions at that point. And so in the book, it's in some sense a grassroots history from the perspective of someone teaching and writing at this time. It picks up different white power extremist attacks, including Tree of Life, the Cruzius attack at El Paso, and then all that loops around in the preface and talks about the Capitol insurrection. So the 3 hinges that sort of open the door to this project, the first hinge, and it relates to this webinar today, was the AAA's call for teach-ins on Charlottesville. And at that time, I had participated in teach-ins linked to my center, but I hadn't actually held a teach-in in my class. And I decided to do so. That call at the time said, we have anthropologists have a lot to say about race and racism, and we can bring this to bear on this public issue. And so I redesigned, that class session, my syllabus. So that's the first hinge. The second is what we might call the Charlottesville why, the question of why this happened, who these actors were, what were their motivations, how did they suddenly become much more visible in this context, and to sort of move away from reductive explanations, which I'll loop around to in a moment. So that's the second hinge. The third hinge is the question, can it happen here? And obviously my book echoes that question, but it was a question that was also posed by Sinclair Lewis, the novelist in the 1930s. As Hitler was rising to power and people in the US, he was hearing everyone saying, well, it can't happen here. And there were sort of the silver shirts, a brown shirt equivalent in the US, and a number of other risk factors that he discusses in his novel. At the same time, many people at this juncture were comparing now President Trump at this time in 2017 to Hitler. That had been going on for quite some time. And while I thought that was overstated, there certainly were some echoes in terms of nationalist rhetoric, ultranationalism, and populism and revitalization. That's discussed in the book as well. So those are the 3 hinges: the AAA call for Charlottesville teach-ins, the Charlottesville why question, and the question, can it happen here? And the 2 dimensions of that, of course, authoritarianism, but I'm particularly interested in someone who's worked on mass violence, about whether forms of mass violence could emerge in the US. So the 2 conceptual blockages, and now I'm on the slide with the 2 giant boulders blocking the freeway. The first one is denial. And in this sense, we can think of notions of American exceptionalism that are frequent. And after the Capitol insurrection, just as after Charlottesville, and as always, people make statements like, this isn't America, this isn't us. So this is a recurrent trope that occurs when events take place in the US that suggest larger issues, they're sort of dismissed through denial. The second conceptual blockage we can refer to maybe as myopia, in the sense of it's a short-sightedness. And through this, we have the problem of what I call the hater, which is that when an event like this takes place, we visualize and speak about white supremacists, they're racist, they're haters, so on and so forth. The problem, well, there's a grain of truth to that, of course. The problem is that it misdirects us from longer term histories, directs us away from structure. So these are the two problems, and they come together in the bad apples trope, which is that, it's a few bad apples and the rest of the country is fine. So the 4 stepping stones. So these are different elements that structure the book. The first, as I've already alluded to, is Trump. He's a figure throughout the book with incitement, hate speech. And the book begins with him reciting the parable of the snake, which was an Aesop fable turned song, pop song, that he reworked into an anti-immigrant campaign recitation. So the snake that you see on the cover refers to this image of the snake, and it's a motif in the book. But anyways, he's there from start to finish. The second stepping stone is my own background as someone who works on mass violence. I've worked in Cambodia for many years. I have a book called Why Did They Kill? Cambodia in the Shadow of Genocide. But these sort of insights of the past, and echoes and understandings, this is something that I bring to bear at different parts of the book. The third stepping stone are the literary strategies that I use. So as opposed to writing, an expository ethnography where I tell, I seek to draw on literary traditions where you show and tell, and in doing that, the book is set in a narrative fashion, in a chronology. It involves setting, character, it involves lots of dialogue, and many of those settings are actually in the classroom at Rutgers. So that's the third stepping stone that structures the book. The last, which is what I'm going to spend the remainder of my time talking about today, is the motif of lessons. So this also gets into the notion of critical pedagogy. So in terms of lessons, on this slide on the far left, we have a quote from Adorno on education after Auschwitz. The center slide says lessons from the past, and the third says TeachIn. So in terms of critical pedagogy, the book at the beginning talks about, and this is pedagogy that informs the teaching, writing after Auschwitz, Adorno, in terms of critical theory, sought to rework pedagogy to have emancipatory critical self-awareness. And that would enable people, he thought, to fight against social forces, institutional domination that crystallized and was epitomized by Auschwitz. So that's in terms of pedagogy, that informs my pedagogy, and I discussed this towards the beginning of the book. As I alluded to before, the notion of lessons from the past, obviously things don't repeat exactly, but there's certain understandings and awareness about certain issues that we can get by looking at the past and drawing on different cases ranging from the Holocaust to, in my case, focusing a lot as well on Cambodia. And a third thing I don't have on here is the notion of moral compass is another, I discussed that towards the end of the book. So moral compass is another aspect of this lessons motif, but the one that I'm going to spend the last 5 minutes or so talking about are teach-ins, and this is with the last visual with 2 teachers, a pencil, and the word teach-in on it. So what is a teach-in? And on this slide, on the left-hand side, we have the same image of TeachIn with two teachers and a picture of Marshall Solins, the late anthropologist, and a large graphic that says behind the headlines, two quotes that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So what is TeachIn? Marshall Solins is one of the people who helped pioneer the notion of the TeachIn in the 60s during the Vietnam War. He held at University of Michigan teach-ins. In terms of, if you look in the dictionary, and this is one of the quotes on the slide, it says it's an extended session on an important and usually controversial issue. Sort of more colloquially, we think about stepping behind the headlines when people are reading about these, students are reading about these events, trying to understand, unpack them, always with the anthropological injunction of denaturalizing and historicizing. So again, going with critical pedagogy, these were my pedagogical goals in holding the teach-in. So now I'm on another slide that has a picture of the book and the table of contents with an arrow pointing to the Charlottesville teach-in, which is the focus of what we're talking about here today, but also was the response to the AAA call that took place that I noted before. So how did I structure the teach-in? So this slide has a few things on it, 4 different things on it. At the center is a graphic that says teach-in on Charlottesville with the AAA logo. There's a 1. And the image has Trump on NBC News, a snapshot of him saying there were very fine people on both sides of Charlottesville, with my caption, critical pedagogy and truth. Across on the upper right-hand side, there's a slide from the AAA website on race that it uses for its different online components that have a picture of a woman with different skin tones, and it says race and history. On the bottom left-hand of the screen is an image of a young man with an eraser mark across his eyes with the words "the hater," and that's actually not mine, that's from a film. And fourth is a picture of Charlottesville marchers with the caption "Blood and soil and you will not replace us." So in the last minute or two, I'm just going to go quickly into, so these were the different components of the class that I taught. And just to give you an example, for example, of at the beginning, so we began by looking at Trump's comment, there were very fine people on both sides. And on this slide, we have that same NBC graphic, and below it are 2 images. The first image on the lower left-hand side says Confederate iconography came long after the Civil War. So at the time, Trump asserted that people were there because of history and heritage. But if you look at the emergence of the statues and different iconography, they all emerge after Jim Crow was setting in, long after the Civil War. And they also have a bubble back up during the Civil Rights Movement. So this is one way to take a statement and to say, well, in fact, people are saying this about history, but it's not, because these monuments obviously are very much bound up with the history of systemic racism. The other image on this slide in the bottom right-hand corner is a poster from Unite the Right with a white woman and man with a banner that says Charlottesville that looks somewhat Nazi-like and Aryan in terms of the iconography. But the point of this is that the people who organized the rally didn't organize a heritage and history rally. They organized a Unite the Right rally, and they explicitly sought to bring together different actors on the far right at this moment in history. And so they explicitly said it wasn't about history and heritage, it's about uniting the right. So this is an example of the sort of exercise we went through. My time's drawing to a close, so I'm just gonna flip through quickly, going to one other slide that takes up the notion of race. This is, I think, important because it drew on the AAA materials. So in this session, people went to the AAA website and looked at the different online modules about what is race. So in the upper right-hand corner, there's that image of the young woman who's also in the center image with different skin tones. We also, on that, looked at the emergence of the concept of race through time. So we took up what a social construction of race, the history of race, and we also touched upon structural racism. In the bottom left-hand corner, there's a small graphic about structural racism and different cultural representations. And up above in the upper left-hand corner of the screen is an image of a Black man looking at a white woman. This is an old sort of comic, not comic, but novel from long ago that says How Sleeps the Beast. This image is from the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, which is a great resource that talks about different caricatures. And this is talking about the brute caricature, which links into criminality. In terms of the hater, so the next slide goes back to the table of contents and book cover. There's an entire chapter on the hater. I'm going to close now. I should just note that a big part of what I was doing as well is to try and unpack who the Charlottesville protesters were, distinguish between different type of far-right extremist groups. You have the anti-government groups, including militias, and then you have the white power actors, and there are different ones of those. So we looked at that. We looked at the history of white power violence and as well as systemic white supremacy. So I'm flipping through the slides. The book takes up, now I'm landing on one other slide, again, of the cover and table of contents. We also discussed in this the notion of white genocide. And to close, I should note that, so I'm on the third to last slide, which is about, which it reads, Tree of Life Teach-In, answering the question why in the 1488 code. And it has a picture of Robert Bowers' Gab social media page, and he has a radar gun with number 1488. And so I taught a Tree of Life teach-in that Willa participated in. And in that we unpack this code. And another chapter of the book talks about the unpacking of this code and the meaning of 1488. 14 is the 14 words, which is from the White Genocide Manifesto. 88 is eighth letter of the alphabet, HH, Heil Hitler. Unfortunately, today I'm back on a slide with the book cover and table of contents. I wasn't able to talk about could it happen here, chapter 4, can it be prevented, chapter 5, the conclusion, the bird, which talks about dialogue and different things. That's the second part of the story. If you're interested, this slide has the NYU promotional graphic about the book, as well as the teacher's guide that we're in the middle of creating and should be out soon. Anyways, if you're interested in reading more, you can get 30% off. It's a hardback, but it's $29 hardback. So the book costs about, with a discount, costs about $20. And in terms of the book, I was pleased it got a Kirkus star and as a tremendously timely and important study of the rhetoric of hatred in our times. And Kirkus, as many of you know, notes books in terms of the writing. So it's nice as a public anthropology exercise to get a starred review. Okay, so I'd now like to move along and introduce the next two speakers. The first speaker is Vinit Singh, who is a Rutgers alumni, and he also was a Peace Corps volunteer in Fiji until the pandemic struck. He focuses on human rights and international policy. His current interests lie around North Korea and the policy concerns around Syria. So he'll be speaking first for about 5 to 7 minutes. The second person, he'll be followed by Willa Withrow Culpepper, who's a doctoral candidate in the Division of Global Affairs. She also teaches, she's recently taught a class, Civil Conflict, and other ones on the sociology of peace and conflict and sociology of violence at Rutgers Newark. She's a member of a number of organizations related to genocide, as well as the Folklore Society, and is a co-founding member of the Research on Atrocity, Identity, and Ideology Network. So I will turn things over to Vinit to begin and rejoin you when we move to the Q&A. So thanks for listening.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Singh. I am a 25-year-old male. I have black hair and a blue shirt on. I was present in Professor Hinton's class in the fall of 2017 when he had this teaching about Charlottesville. And Charlottesville took place in August of 2017. So when we first talked about it, our class and I, we knew a little bit about it from reading the news or watching the news. However, we didn't know too much about it until Professor Hinton broke down and went through the different characters and everyone. We talked about Richard Spence and we talked about different ideologies as well. One of the things that I took away from that lecture was the room reaction. There's a Vice video that talks about the different backgrounds and how everything started, to the recruitment and to the opposing side. And it interviewed different characters and actors involved in Charlottesville. After that video, the class and I, we were surprised and we were stunned because we go to Rutgers Newark. Rutgers Newark is considered to be one of the most diverse campuses. And the question was posed, could something like this happen at Rutgers, especially around Newark? The answer was no for most of us. We felt like that was something that was out of the ordinary, and we didn't know anything that was happening behind the scenes. And most in particular, we were focusing on people who were shouting certain slogans, such as the replacement theory. Professor Hinton went over statements such as Jews will not replace us or blood and soil. We were asked about if we were surprised about these statements and where these statements came from. And did we expect something like this? Majority of the class said no. We felt as though this is something that came out of nowhere with then President Trump. However, when we looked through the AAA's website about race, what is race? We looked at Jamestown. We talked about different policies throughout the years, especially around the Jim Crow era, past that, if there's something that happened that could have started this. The class and I started to talk about different ideologies and if there is something that's beneath the surface. And there is this image that Professor Hinton mentioned about an iceberg, but what's been below the iceberg, that was on one of his PowerPoint slides in that teaching. And it's that not everything is what it seems. There's something that lies below. So we started to ask ourselves, how did recruitment happen? And we talked about how recruitment back then could have happened. And we talked about how it's a word of mouth, almost like a pyramid scheme back then, where you were assigned certain people, you would recruit someone else, you were under certain groups of people. Nowadays, the use of Facebook, Reddit, back then it was 4chan. 4chan maybe still be popular, or some people mentioned Discord, which is very popular with gaming channels. We talked about Facebook groups as well, and how back then it was more tolerable to post things, to get likes, to get clicks. That was one of the things we talked about, which is how does recruitment happen? Why do people join? And who do these people target? And oftentimes we talked about power and who in their right minds believes that they're going to be losing the power and who is to blame. These were topics that we talked about, and many people decided that a lot of the topics kind of came out from President Trump, and that these topics were certain topics that resonated with individuals that were outside New Jersey. And people decided to ask different questions, such as, could this happen in other parts of New Jersey? Or are we lucky that this doesn't happen here? And Professor Hinton posed a question one time, which was, could this happen again? Or could something else like this happen? And I thought about this when I saw the January 6th riots, because it was something that was similar through recruitment as well. And there were similar actors and similar people that took place. And one of the biggest things I took away from that was the theories of replacement and the hate speech. And a big portion of what I thought about recently was about the Alabama law about yoga, which talks about how Alabama now allows yoga back in schools. However, there's a fear of Hinduism. So they're taking away the Hinduism element and replacing it with different verbs and different toolage in hopes and fears that no one will convert to Hinduism. So we focused around the blood and soil, the ideologies, and who can take part in this. And that was something that we talked about. And Professor Hinton provided us discussion questions, which we talked about. and we wrote out in the beginning of the class, beginning of the year. Then afterwards, we responded to those questions, talking about how we felt. Was this a surprise? And that was the biggest takeaway, which is not everything is what it seems, and to figure out different ideologies and to not always go for a source that you resonate with, to look at every other sources and to be a little bit smarter to figuring out which source is authentic and which is not, and which may be misleading. Those were one of the biggest things I took away from the teachers from Charlottesville. And it definitely shows, and has an impact in today's day and age. Thank you for that. I want to turn it over to Willa.
Thanks, Vineet. I am a 30-year-old white woman wearing a white button-up shirt and gold glasses in my kitchen in Pennsylvania. So thinking back to when we did these teach-ins reminds me, especially reading the book is kind of very transportative in that, as Dr. Hinton mentioned, he and I are part of some of the same academic groups around genocide scholarship, and I'm proud to be one of the emerging young scholars network in the International Association of Genocide Scholars and Perpetrator Research. But even then, there's a big disagreement still that he alludes to when he says, what makes a man starts fire, about what is the line between understanding and empathizing. And if we try to understand what draws people to these movements and explains why they take part, does that mean that we are over empathizing and humanizing them? And this is still very relevant in perpetrator studies and genocide studies, but particularly when you're talking about this and bringing it into a classroom, because especially on a campus as diverse as Rutgers, this is not just like an abstract concept of violence to a lot of students, particularly when we watched the Vice documentary that took part in Charlottesville. That's really emotional for a lot of people in the classroom and is hard, particularly when you watch the scene where Heather Heyer gets hit by the car. So when Dr. Hinton in his book mentioned the Overton window, I couldn't help but think about how even now that's changed, that when she died at Charlottesville, it was considered shocking, perhaps maybe a tipping point, that people would start realizing how far the far right had managed to entrench itself into certain political discourses and communities in America and their threat. But in the last couple months and weeks, we've had various states pass new laws that if a car hits a protester, it's not considered homicide. It can be considered self-defense. So we've even moved so far from that feeling of shock to kind of a normalization of it, as well as the fact that this discourse is narrowing, that even in the last year after the death of George Floyd, that we're starting to see more and more people outside of classrooms talk about systematic racism, that it's being politicized in such a strange way that, you know, you can see Congress and congressmen, many of whom have never stepped foot in a classroom, talking to students, saying critical race theory doesn't exist, systematic racism doesn't exist. But how could you say that to our students, many of whom who live that every day? So we're finding ourselves at these targets of these culture wars where, you know, you can't call something by its name, yet it's instructive to not only students of color, but also white students to understand this world we're living in, how these things happen. So these teach-ins were massively instructive and helpful in breaking that down in a safe area for discussion, particularly during really heightened moments of emotional response, because I was a teaching assistant for Dr. Hinton during the Squirrel Hill teach-in. And so I commute from Pennsylvania every day. I had friends from Pittsburgh who were affected, and also my TA office was next to a faculty member who was from that community at both the synagogue and Pittsburgh. So heightened emotion. And then I went to the class and collected the papers at the end. And one of the key questions that Dr. Hinton had asked students was, you know, what made the perpetrator take part? And a lot of students said white genocide, white genocide. And I was flipping through these papers where they said white genocide, white genocide. And I think that's when we went back and realized, okay, it's not enough to sometimes realize if we're approaching this from an academic point of view to be like, clearly white genocide is a construct and it's politically loaded and being manipulated. And that's when he kind of started this additional process of breaking it down even further. And I got to see firsthand how helpful that was for students to say, okay, you can't just use this loaded phrase and write it down on a paper because you think it's the right answer, because that's what the perpetrator said was the right answer, to interrogate that and not only to interrogate what he meant, but how does that fit into society, and both then and now. So thank you.
Okay, this is Jeff Martin with the AAA, and that was a great presentation. We're now going to open it up to questions and answers. So if any of you have a question, also feel free, if you're so inclined, to turn your video on, since again we don't have a lot of people attending, so it's not going to affect the bandwidth. Feel free to turn your mic and or your camera on if you want to be a part of this conversation. But let's open it up. What are your thoughts out there? Either on the topic itself or the teach-in aspect of it. Thank you for joining us. Anyone? Cheryl, Uzi, Christina, any questions or comments?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you so much. I'm Uzi Baram. I teach anthropology at New College of Florida, and I just finished teaching a course on race and ethnicity and global perspective at the college, small honors college in Sarasota, Florida. And one of the things I wrestle with, and maybe any of you can address it, I include genocide within the curriculum, including your work, Professor. I have a trouble for the students not feeling helpless and hopeless. That as much as I end the course on examples of coexistence and people who struggle to get along, even though I lay out the 10 warning signs of genocide with their layout of what you can do, every time I teach it, students, they look sad during the class periods, and they usually comment afterwards that it's frankly depressing. Do you have any suggestions or ideas of taking this and empowering them rather than getting them overwhelmed?
Yeah, no, that's thanks for the question. That's a great question and a very difficult topic. In addition to teaching about genocide, I also, I teach courses on human rights as well. And in a way, you get some of the same stuff because people look at what's happening in the world and they say, no one can do anything. So often there are many different dimensions to addressing this, but one of the ways to give more hope is to take a historical view and, for example, go back to the Holocaust and look at what we had in terms of infrastructures that exist and ability to respond. And if you actually take that temporal view, you see that we have a massive number of infrastructures that, flawed as they may be, now can be mobilized, both on the global level, transnational level, regional level, domestic level in terms of civil rights actors, grassroots level, and these different levels are connected in all sorts of different ways. They've been enabled by the internet. So inevitably, this is the first thing that students do. We talk about what's going on in the world. People pick something, Myanmar, right, would be coming up now, as well as other crises. But, so we say, yeah, well, certainly there are flaws, but we go back, and if you go to the beginning and see what we have now, it's remarkable, almost shocking that what was a dream back, and again, very flawed, lots of ways to critique it. But if you just look at what existed at the time of the Holocaust versus what we have now, it's cause for optimism of a sort, flaws aside. So that's one thing. When I wrote this book, I intentionally had, it's lots of stuff that, as you say, it's very depressing. It's very hard. I mean, a lot of the book looks at U.S. history going back to settler colonialism, enslavement, so on and so forth. As one of the risk factors for genocide is past genocide, and the U.S. has this over and over again. Though again, it's sort of pushed aside with exceptionalism, but in terms of writing it and then tracing out using risk factor assessment, what the situation looked like in the US as we moved from April 2019, when I gave a first talk that was related to the book, I sort of said, you know, things, if we do the kettle on a stove, things are simmering somewhat, but it's not like a high boil. Well, so what's another factor? Of course, things like economic collapse, social protest, and pandemic. So suddenly the situation shot up dramatically. And we had the erosion of those checks and balances that are one of those infrastructures that you were alluding to as well. And so I actually wrote an op-ed in October of last year warning that the risk factors situation was really bad in the US. Capitol insurrection was tip of the iceberg. It's an awful thing. In a strange way, though, it may have actually diffused the situation. Because imagine that you didn't have the Capitol insurrection, what might have happened, right? And if then President Trump had kept on with Twitter, we had all the white power groups mobilized, the situation was really bad. It continues to be alarming. I would say we've sort of gone down to the 2019 level of a rapid simmer. So anyways, but sort of bringing it back, I also intentionally wanted to have a chapter on can it be prevented to sort of speak to this issue that you're raising, and it talks about things like transitional justice. I just published a Sapiens op-ed calling for a truth commission on white supremacy. Anyways, and it looks at different infrastructures that we have. I recently spoke to an atrocity prevention group and sort of said, you know, we need to think about doing domestic atrocity prevention monitoring. Right now, it's only focused outward. So again, there are many different ways. I think that, and then moral compass and dialogue, as you alluded to, I talk about that in the book. And in the book, talking about Toni Morrison's Nobel speech, where she talks about the bird in the hand. And it's, anyways, I don't want to digress. I love that address, but it's, you know, that's the ending. It starts with Trump and the snake, and it ends with the bird. Anyway, so, you know, great question. Thank you. I don't know if Vanita or Willa have anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, something I wanted to add to that is that I'm actually working on a project with Timothy Williams, who's a perpetrator researcher in Munich, about the efficacy of Holocaust education in anti-racist outcomes, because in a lot of states, including New Jersey, it's mandated through high school. So by the time most of my students get to me, they've had mandated Holocaust education. But this year they wanted to ask me, after George Floyd, about the 1776 commission from the Trump administration, why there was such a backlash over teaching critical race theory or systematic racism or any of this, which in social science is very matter of fact, but now they're starting to realize it's controversial. And they couldn't figure out why things like Holocaust education are mandatory, but these other classes are incredibly controversial. And I said, well, you know, the police department in Newark, as well as the FBI and ICE, all take courses at USM that are supposed to, I guess, are designed to make them more sensitive or to question authority. And they, to them, were so confused about what the connection between those two things were. So I think part of the problem is that Holocaust education has been designed in this country that it hasn't been updated in a long time. It's people ask it to do a certain amount of stuff, but also kids are desensitized a lot of the time. So in that case, I find often that knowledge is the most powerful thing for them, where if you manage to link it to other situations, other genocides, other developments, I try to link it to Hannah Arendt, structural things, that they start to see it as a bigger part of a pattern rather than this kind of anomaly. And I think that makes it easier for them to think about what would they do if they were in that situation, rather than per se 1943 Germany. They could relate that situation through a more universal sense, whether it's the streets of Newark versus, you know, now a lot of discussions about bystanding, particularly during attacks on Asian Americans, that they have found in Europe that the most successful forms of Holocaust education focus on upstanding. So rather than making students feel bad or feel sad, it's about making them feel about, okay, what could you have done productively? And now there's so many discussions about the reality that you see someone being harassed. So I have found that effective, just giving them enough information to let them kind of do their own links, but also realistically, and a student mentioned this to me, I actually never thought of it, was just making resources available, because half the time I don't know what my students' histories are, and they might not be comfortable sharing those. And halfway through the semester, I had a student saying, hey, maybe you should put up a slide or an announcement with the counseling services at the university, or, you know, if they need to speak to someone, because we're talking about pretty heavy stuff. And sometimes kids will just switch off if they feel like they can't engage with it. So that's just my 2 cents.
Hi, this is Cheryl Crawley. I was going to just chime in with a big thank you to Dr. Hinton for doing this. It's something that's very, very needed. I'm in my second round, I feel like, with racism, so on in the US, being probably the oldest person on this webinar right at the moment. I remember the 60s vividly. I lived the 60s, and now we're in it again. And so I'm so thankful that, well, I guess I should also say that I've been a school administrator for most of my career and a superintendent of schools for 20 years. And what I have observed of student bodies is that our young people are learning and things are changing. And I have tremendous hope with our youth in this country. That's enough for right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Christina Wirtz. I'm an anthropologist and professor and chair of a Spanish department at Western Michigan University. And in the course of my teaching career, I have frequently had the opportunity to teach about race and racism, as well as to incorporate some of the broader kinds of issues into more general anthropology classes. And I really appreciate this presentation. Thank you to all three of the presenters for a lot of food for thought and really useful pointers and resources. I had a question that in some ways picks up on the last thing that Willa said, and something that came up in Benit's comments as well. And it has to do with, you know, sort of our positionality as professors and the fact that in any given classroom, there can be, as Willa said, very different histories and vulnerabilities that students feel. And I feel like I'm really good at the intellectualizing part and the historicizing, contextualizing, critiquing, offering alternate frameworks. I mean, kind of what we're trained to do. The part that I do not feel prepared to do, other than the resource, you know, counseling resources on campus kind of thing, is to handle the fact that different students are going to come to the discussion and react to it in very different ways. And, you know, where on the one hand, you might have a class where, you know, as in Willa's example, you know, half the students write white genocide, you know, as the reason for, you know, something. But, you know, in that class, there may well, and it may just be one sometimes, or a very few students who feel much more vulnerable and where the material is much more, it's their life, right? It's their own survival. And I wondered, I'm always looking for ideas, strategies for how to handle, you know, if you will, the sort of emotional side of productively leading class discussion, to allow people to process, to allow people to feel safe getting educated, you know, gaining the knowledge and the perspective that they may not have, but at the same time protecting, you know, protecting especially the students who may feel particularly vulnerable. And I have, you know, after, you know, 15, 20 years of teaching at the university level, you know, I have, you know, in my own teaching history, you know, deeply painful examples of situations where I feel as professor, I failed a student, you know, because we discussed something charged and I did not set it up to, you know, and I felt like, gee, I may well have harmed a student, you know, instead of doing, you know, what I would see our mission as being, which is to at least, you know, do no harm.
Yeah, thanks so much. You know, that's a great question. And yeah, Willa also took that up and covered a lot of the ground. In terms of, you know, what to do. So it depends on the class, I think, is one thing as well, and even the topic, because people self-select into classes. So if you have a class with the word genocide in it, you to some extent get self-selecting that goes on, as opposed to a class that's more topical, like a class on race that then would do genocide as part of that. I think you would run into that even more in that situation, but it's absolutely difficult material. Reading, again, depending on the person's history, reading back in history puts things at a distance that then sometimes when you move to the present helps to some degree. I found that teaching, and I did a class, I sort of revamped my genocide class to take up white genocide as an issue, and it touched much closer than any other class I'd taught before, especially looking back. Cheryl mentioned the civil rights movement, and this is actually a key juncture where white power shifts from being about sort of maintaining white supremacy to taking on tropes of victimization that we now have being taken to the extreme and being played upon by President Trump. But there were all sorts of things. There were comic books, graphic comic books that were written. I was going to talk about the head of the National Alliance, who was he wrote a book called The Turner Diaries that some of you may be familiar with. It's like a genocidal fantasy where whites take over the world and kill all non-whites. And it's sold hundreds of thousands of copies, have been downloaded many more. The FBI refers to as the Bible of the far right. Anyways, that same organization produced a comic book to appeal to youngsters. And I went, and you can actually get a PDF of it, and I taught it. And that was a material that was so close and so graphic that it really was upsetting to students. And so I think, Willa touched on a number of different things, but sort of empathy, listening, having counseling services if they're needed. That was one moment where things got really close in terms of the undergraduate class I was teaching. So there's no easy solution to this, and really every class is different. The dynamics are different, the students are different, and you always encounter the unexpected, and it's really hard. So you do the best you can to sort of set up structures of support. But every day, each year we walk into the classroom and it's a new classroom, and strange things are bound to happen for the good. And you also have really difficult situations that emerge sometimes. So I don't think that's all that helpful of an answer, but it's sort of, it's something you have to be attuned to and respond to as it emerges. I don't know if Willa, you or anyone else has anything you'd like to add, or Vineet?
I haven't been teaching for very long, just about 3 years. So I'm still learning. Every semester I've learned something different. And obviously online teaching has been a massively new approach to this. But the feedback I've had from students was spending more time. I've dedicated now probably about just under a quarter of each seminar to putting them into smaller groups. So usually groups of 3 or 4, to let them discuss something between themselves before that. And not only did I find that engagement picked up massively, that people who were usually afraid of talking in class felt more comfortable, but I think it really helped them explore a lot of feelings and thoughts they were having around subject matters with their peers, and not having the fear of, well, maybe I'll sound stupid, or maybe I'll get the answer wrong. So, and the feedback I had from students in our kind of automatic feedback system at the school was that this was one of the things they enjoyed the most. So I think I'm going to try to find a way to preserve that going forward, and maybe give them like a 5 or 10 minute window at the beginning of every seminar to bring up or talk about anything they want. Because we've had a couple special sessions, like after the Atlanta spa shooting, we had a lesson where I had to abandon the lesson plan. I said, we can talk about whatever you want. And they wanted to talk about things like anti-Asian racism, and they wanted to explore things that were outside the lesson plan, but still connected. And I ended up having to do that last semester too, because we finished just around the time of the George Floyd protests, and a lot of my students wrote to me saying, I wish we were still in class, there's a lot I want to talk about. And I said, do you guys want a newsletter all through the summer? So that's what I did, was every 2 weeks I would send them out a newsletter that had tools or resources or things. And I said, if anyone wants to talk, you can email me. And I actually had quite a few students, some of whom didn't even want anything, they just wanted to rant and email about how angry they felt. And I said, that's fine. So again, I'm still learning. I'm trying to basically let them tell me, and like Dr. Hinton said, every class is different, but also giving them the space to make them feel that they can talk back, that it's not kind of one way the entire time, has really helped.
Perfect. Thank you, Willa. Vineet, were you going to comment?
Yes. So being a student in Professor Hinton's class, when we first heard the information and we dug into Charlottesville and just the whole class, a lot of us, the reaction was, what's the point of even saying anything? That's nothing's going to change. It's always going to be like this. Nothing's ever going to change. What's the point of voting, right? But like Willa said, like Professor Hinton said, breaking people into groups and allowing people just to vent. I remember when we had that end of the semester project, we talked about different topics and we did our own presentations. Some people kind of went off script and just started to cuss, and that helped them during the presentation because they were just so frustrated, but it allowed them to kind of let out some frustration. And even when President was teaching, when we were having quiet time to read, he would allow us to read in groups sometimes. So people would kind of highlight and be like, did you see what happened? Or, can you believe this? And it gave people the avenue to kind of say things and be part of different discussions. And also I found it very helpful to having clubs. Sometimes we had guest speakers come in that Professor Hinton had, or sometimes we had sponsored events and different club organizations that came on that would allow to help the community. And even though it doesn't have to do anything with genocide, it does show a step in the right direction for people, for young people who do want to step in, help the community out and be part of something bigger. So that was something that a lot of people took away, and it allowed them to de-stress. And Professor Hinton did also say, he kind of gave a disclaimer about how certain topics would be a little bit difficult to swallow. So there was always this open door policy. If when you step out for a second, come back in, we can talk about it. If not, we can kind of just brush through it. Make sure you get the notes just in case. But things like that, if people need to step out, or if you want to get involved, or just kind of vent, even during a presentation, obviously you don't want to go off and say certain things, but just giving that safe space of just saying a personal experience and kind of relating, because your experience can be different from someone else's, but the same ideologies, the same symptoms can kind of come from that. So it gave a clear platform for people to talk.
Thank you, Vineet. I appreciate that. This conversation, I knew we were going to go right up to the hour, and we could even go further. But fortunately, we are at the top of the hour. It was difficult because it's May and they're done grading papers, they're done taking tests, people are moving on. But what I'd like to do is invite Alex and Vineet and Willa back, possibly in the fall, when we can have another discussion and keep this going. This is a topic that is going to be around and remain. And Professor Hinton, you brought up that 2019, the rhetoric has died down to 2019. 2024 is right around the corner, and it's going to well up again. So if not even before. So, pardon me?
Well before. I think if the social media network comes back, that's that Trump is setting up some, then we've got some problems.
Yeah, I completely agree. Okay, so I think that's it. Thank you to our presenters. Appreciate it. Thank you for all of you who showed up. Really appreciate it. Great job all around. Good questions. And again, look for this in the fall. I think we're going to try and have this again in the fall. It'll be great. So thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.